Tonight, I am going to be talking about section 4 in the book How to Do Life, chapter 21 and chapter 22. Chapter 21 is titled Theories of Happiness, East and West. And this whole section here is about the concept of happiness. In Buddhism, happiness is almost as important as suffering, that they are considered to be inseparable. They're different, but they're inseparable. Now, the better we understand suffering, the better we understand happiness. This is one reason why they are inseparable. Quote, if we do not bother with what makes us suffer, how we suffer, the nature of suffering, or where that suffering comes from, we will be less equipped to produce happiness. And of course, in Buddhism, it is looked at that all beings want to be happy and all beings want to be free of suffering. So there are different views of happiness in the East and the West. And in terms of the East, he pretty much talks about Buddhism. I think the other theories of happiness he talks about are predominantly from the West, but I'm not positive about that. There are philosophical arguments, logical reasonings behind a lot of these. And then when it comes to the personal level, a lot of people, if you would ask them what their theory is, might not even have a theory. They just behave this way without much conceptualization behind it. It's more habitual patterns and beliefs and so forth. So the first one that he talks about is chasing pleasure. Hedonism is a Western philosophical term, and it is about immediate satisfaction, immediate gratification. And the object of the desire might be external or it could be internal. But basically it is, if I possess this object, I will be happy. Prahlad Rinpoche says it can be a car, it can be being smarter, it can be recognition or fame, it could be looking younger. So happiness is equal to experiencing pleasure in this first version of happiness. The second that he talks about is a longer term goal and satisfaction and happiness. Here you have a perspective of your life and an idea of how to accomplish these goals that you have in life. Here, happiness is related to your relationship to the object, how close you are to fulfilling your goals. So a person sees that they can't fulfill every desire, and you need a purpose in life. Here is my example. Your public education, you prepare to go to college, and then you go to college and prepare for a career. And then after graduating from college, maybe you go to graduate school or maybe you go right to work, but then you have this goal of moving up the ladder in your career and to have maybe a comfortable retirement. So we have these goals, and then you use these to focus on what is going to make you happy and what isn't. And you also have some restraint on your desires, but not necessarily restraint on other desires if it's goal-oriented. Now, the third approach is discriminating or judgment of the objects of desire, ranking them in terms of what's important to acquire. Which is more important, career or family? Inner conflicts will still arise from this approach because you still have this idea of this is more important than that. It's not a clearly defined line between what is most important and what isn't so important. All of these approaches have this inner conflict that we have a conflicting set of interests which can change from day to day, month to month, year to year, and so forth. That, putting it another way, he talks about having many internal voices that are directing us in one direction or another, and that this will lead to conflict one way or another, no matter what, and that this conflict can cause unhappiness, among other things. Going into that a little bit more, he says that some thinkers talk of the impossibility of creating harmony between the quote, warring factions within one's being. From this approach, it's impossible to have harmony, and therefore it's impossible to have happiness. Happiness is just a dream, an impossible dream. Another approach is we need to find harmony and a predominant voice and follow that predominant voice. A third approach, we shouldn't look at happiness as a goal. We should not be thinking about satisfying desires. I'm not sure what name to put on that. He doesn't put a name on it either. But anyway, we humans shouldn't be so focused on satisfying desires and being happy. To go on, he says that most agree that happiness and desire are linked, regardless of how they conclude about following desire and being happy. Buddhists also feel the same way, that happiness and desire are linked. Also, happiness and ethics are linked. This is something that humans can think about and have concepts about, and that is the idea of fairness, worthiness, good, bad, and so forth. There are moral and ethical reasons to behave that contradict satisfying desires. Some people conclude that happiness shouldn't be a concern for humans, that ethics and morality trumps happiness. Buddhism says that we can be happy and follow ethical behavior, that these are not mutually exclusive. Our desires change from day to day, even moment to moment. He uses the term human nature is not fixed, that we can learn new ways of thinking, new ways of being, new ways of doing, and we can let a desire be. By letting it be, it may, quote, live out its useful date. I kind of like that. By letting a desire be, we may just realize that we don't have desire for it anymore. It's no longer useful. Also, it's important to realize that sharing other people's happiness produces happiness. When you're with a group of people and if they are happy, that leads you to feel happy. And there's also this element of morality in consideration for others. So he is interjecting this idea of how other people can affect our happiness. Then he has a long list of topics that point to the Buddhist perspective, and I'm just going to read them. The first one is desire and the objects of desire. The second is goals. The third is how we satisfy our desires. The link between dissatisfaction and pain. Does happiness come from harmonizing conflicting tendencies? And then finally, morality. And I've touched on some of these already. So now we get to go into this in more depth. First of all, morality helps to overcome this conflict within and conflict we can have with other people. This can open up the conditions for happiness to enter. On the other end, that inner conflict will not be eliminated totally until you are totally enlightened. Don't expect that this will totally disappear as you travel the path. He makes a point of avoiding confusing the meditation experience with post-meditation experience. When we meditate, we may have fewer difficulties arise, learn how to let go of things, and so forth. When we're not meditating, it's pretty much impossible to avoid difficulties. They seem to present themselves almost relentlessly. What came to my mind when he was talking about that was in the old KTD building. There in the dining area, there was a pop machine, or maybe a soda machine is what they would say on the East Coast. And I saw Barter Tulpa Rinpoche go over there one day, put some money in the slot, push the button to have what he bought come out, and nothing came out. That's the way life works. Just because you are recognized as being a Rinpoche doesn't mean that difficulties don't arise. Just because when you meditate, you might have a level of stability, mental stability, good concentration. When you get off the cushion, well, it's a whole different world. Tralik Rinpoche says that happiness can actually arise from a sense of struggle. Quote, some forms of pain can wake us up and teach us certain things about life. Skillful means, he talks about, that life can help us learn skillful means, how to work with difficulties, difficult people, pop machines not working, and how to work with these difficulties in a way that is beneficial, that we can grow spiritually. He says that how we work with the difficulties is more important than the difficulty itself, that these help us see the importance of being flexible, see that change and impermanence is always there. So these are actually very important. The more flexible we become, the less solid we look at ourselves, the happier we're going to be. And this then has an influence on our self-image. How we see ourselves is important in terms of happiness. Are we resilient or are we clinging to solidity, not wanting to change? Interesting statement, which change and consistency are both necessary, that we have to realize when it's time to change and when being consistent is more important. It's a balance between changing and being consistent. If we are open to new possibilities and new circumstances, we do not have to completely abandon who you were, but we can go off in new directions and not have a problem with that. I guess another example would be, or a way to talk about this would be not too tight and not too loose, where you don't completely abandon who you were, which would be too loose, and too tight would be not wanting to see new possibilities arise. So to go on, he talks about it takes ingenuity to play the many roles that we are in during our life. We are presented with lots of different circumstances where people will look at us in one circumstance one way and in another circumstance another way. At home, you might be a father, you could be a partner. At work, you've got co-workers. You go to the doctor and you're a patient, and each of these circumstances require you to be a little different. So this is where the flexibility comes in. So in Buddhism, the conditions for happiness don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be strict. Unlike some of these Western approaches, this internal conflict can actually be looked at positively. It can be telling us new ways to go forward, new discoveries. Very simply, we can grow from difficulties. To sum up this chapter, he says that we need to learn to deal with the stillness experienced in meditation and, quote, the dynamic nature of our involvement with the world. So looking for happiness and being happy, we're not trying to escape from the world. There is a relative level and an absolute level, and that we need to understand both levels. What came to my mind when I read that last part of that chapter was Trungpa Rinpoche had a book by the title of Orderly Chaos. And I think that is pointing to the same thing, that on the relative level, there is a lot of chaos. On the other hand, we can take in the chaos and give back order. Now, the next chapter is chapter 22, and this is happiness and its relation to suffering. To begin with, he starts out by talking about the previous chapter. And so since I just talked about that, I am going to skip through the beginning part of this chapter. to kind of sum up the Buddhist approach, suffering is useful if we have the right attitude, but it's not necessarily a good thing. We don't have to rejoice because we're suffering or someone else is suffering and now they're going to learn. Now I'm going to learn. So we don't, you might say, invite the suffering, but we don't have to because it appears anyway. He says that we can have goals. From a Buddhist perspective, the ultimate goal is through practice and study, we will attain enlightenment, and the everyday goal are pursuits to have a good life, be comfortable, have food, shelter, and so on and so forth. And these goals can work together. They do not have to be mutually exclusive. He's talked about this a number of times in previous chapters of the book. He says, whatever position we are in life, it's important to do things to the best of our ability. And that is following the teachings, practicing non-harm, and doing as good a job as we can with whatever it is. He talks about renunciation. Very simply, renunciation is letting go of the causes of suffering, renouncing the causes of suffering. Renunciation in Buddhism doesn't mean becoming a monastic or going to a cave and removing yourself from the world. In monasteries, there is a close relationship with the monastics, whether they be monks or nuns, and the lay people that live around the monastery. It's a relationship, and this relationship or interpersonal dimension to our lives, whether we be a monastic or a lay person, is important. This can help us experience happiness, and it enriches our human experience. Again, realization can be attained by either a lay person or a monastic. And quite honestly, when you go to a monastery over in Asia, a lot of the monastics have jobs that might seem very mundane, like cooking, cleaning up, maintenance, taking out the trash, and doing all the things that a layperson might be involved in or hire people to be involved in. They're workers, and they're there in the monastery, not because they want to attain enlightenment, but because this is where they live. And some of them are there because they want to be serious practitioners and study and have more involvement in traveling the path. But monasteries have need for all kinds of workers. And this is an important thing to remember. They may get together and say prayers regularly on a daily basis, but they have different motivations for being there. And it doesn't mean that lay people can't have the same level of commitment of monastics. Tralek Rinpoche says that we can learn through living that there's no contradiction between, quote, orienting our lives towards attaining nirvana and to go about leading a normal life and satisfying our desires as a normal, responsible, ethical, and moral person. So I think those last few words kind of sum up the approach for a lay person, and that is to act responsibly, ethically, and morally, but you still can satisfy your desires as long as they're not excessive. He uses that term a lot, excessive desires. We, of course, need a place to stay. We like to have financial security. We like to have food on a regular basis, and so on and so forth. There's nothing wrong with that. We need to have our physical needs met. We need a supportive social environment, friends. We need freedom to practice, a safe environment. These are not in conflict with wanting to attain enlightenment. This is what came to my mind when I was reading that part. Now, because of my age, when I go in to see the doctor, it all depends, but sometimes I'm asked a series of questions like, do you feel safe at home? Have you ever had to forego a meal because you couldn't afford it? These are pretty ordinary needs that we all have. Housing security, food security, feeling safe at home. that you're not under threat of being hurt, harmed, or this sort of thing. We need to look at our shortcomings in a useful way to avoid being a negative person trapped in negative thinking about our negativity. This is something, too, that he has addressed in other parts of this book. We as humans have the capacity to manage and overcome whatever we meet. It doesn't mean we always have a good outcome that we want, but that we have an outcome that we can benefit from, that we can learn from, that we can grow from. We can be happy, yet we can experience pain, struggle, life's ups and downs. This he keeps talking about over and over in these 2 chapters, that life doesn't always go the way you want it to, but we can work with it. It's workable. It's our mind that we are working with. How we respond to what we meet is most important. The teachings and practice, meditation, for instance, can empower us and help us be in whatever role is needed at the time and feel comfortable in that role. He does not use the functional self here, but I'm going to use it because of the fluid nature of life. With a functional self that knows how to function in different situations, that we can be whoever we need to be at the time. We're not stuck in roles that are not appropriate to where we are at the time. So understanding suffering helps us appreciate life and happiness. I'm going to stress appreciate life and happiness. He then makes a distinction between pain and suffering. Pain tends to be directly related to physical and mental experience. However, suffering and unhappiness has many layers to it or parts to it, and there is not a direct relationship to pain. He says that suffering is experienced as a sense of dissatisfaction, that unhappiness is an increased sense of suffering and of being unfulfilled. He goes on to say that pain is easier to work with than suffering, and as a result, not too much is said in Buddhism about pain. Pain can be fixed, can be overcome, can be understood relatively easily. Suffering is much more difficult. It's multifaceted, different layers, different parts. And it's really easy to treat suffering like pain and thinking that there's a simple remedy. And if I just do this, no problem. But of course, that isn't the way it works. Suffering and unhappiness require more significant remedies. I guess a good example just came to mind of pain and suffering. Pain is when your car breaks down. Suffering comes when you start thinking, well, what am I going to do to get to work? How am I going to pay for this? How much is it going to cost? Yada, 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 all kinds of thoughts about the car breaking down. There's a very conceptual element to suffering and unhappiness. The suffering and unhappiness are more enduring and more pervasive. They're difficult to let go of. You keep bringing these thoughts up over and over and over again. In Mahayana Buddhism, it says we've got to understand suffering. We've got to know suffering. We've got to understand its value and understand the difference between suffering and pain. Again, we don't fix suffering like you might fix pain. So there are 4 contemplations that he ends this chapter with, referring to as suffering. The first is the good qualities of suffering in terms of its ability to spur us on to liberation. So think about what benefit and qualities there are in your experience suffering. First of all, suffering is what makes us human. It keeps us from being overcome by pleasure and being distracted, which is very easy to do. It motivates us to look deeper below the surface and investigate. Why am I suffering? Why is this causing so much suffering? And pain doesn't usually have that effect. It's a very different, more pervasive experience. Suffering can lead to a feeling of life's meaninglessness. What's it all about? It just doesn't seem to make any meaning at all here. And this can, again, propel you forward on the path, realizing that being caught up in all the daily distractions have no significant meaning. So suffering can be useful and helpful, and it counteracts complacency, or laziness is another word for that. The second point is suffering helps dispel arrogance. When you are suffering, it's humbling. Kind of takes you down a notch or two, that you start seeing, or at least have the opportunity to see that others experience this, and other people experience a sense of meaninglessness or void or emptiness. Suffering is ubiquitous. I've been going to a lot of clinics lately, and they're full of people that are suffering from one illness or another. A third point is that suffering teaches us to let go of bad attitudes or bad behaviors. We have the possibility of seeing the link between our experience, our thoughts, and our actions. And we have this opportunity to, or begin to see, that the results of having a bad attitude or not dealing with things in a wholesome way leads to places that are very uncomfortable, full of lots of suffering and negativity. To see that we're not benefiting ourselves or anyone else by wallowing in the suffering, and that there is benefit from having a right attitude in a wholesome, constructive manner, behaving responsibly. The last point is the good quality of producing compassion. So if we can start seeing other people are suffering like us, perhaps more than us, our hearts can open up to the pain that other people are having, that we can start feeling connected to other people. And it's interesting that when you start connecting to other people, realizing that they are suffering, and you start thinking about them, you're thinking about your own suffering less, and that causes you to suffer less. So to end this chapter, here is a quote: "The experience of suffering can make us feel connected to others and less isolated and confined to our own egoic preoccupations and self-possessive ways of thinking and behaving." I'm going to read that over again. The experience of suffering can make us feel connected to others and less isolated and confined to our own egoic preoccupations and self-possessive ways of thinking and behaving. So in this way, we attempt to think of the experience and try to put it to good use with the right attitude.